Our next speaker is from a field that I think most of us wouldn't associate with climate change at all. Dr. David Collings is an English professor at Bowdoin College in Maine, and his field of research and scholarship has been primarily focused on 19th century Romanticism, British literature of the Romantic era. Although recently I just discovered that he also has more recent interests also in the English literature of South Asia, the diaspora as well, which is interesting because I've been working in South Asia. But he, in 2014, so 2 years ago, published a book called Stolen Future, Broken Present, The Human Significance of Climate Change. And this, I found it absolutely fascinating because it's an example of someone who, for his own intellectual reasons and reasons of engagement, has really gotten very deeply into the science of climate change, but entirely from the outside, not as a scientist, but just because he felt that this was something to understand and to know more about, and to look at the way in which he himself responded to it, and also friends, individuals, and society at large, is working with this both on a practical level and also on an emotional level, which is one of the aspects that I think we don't generally address in a scientific forum, but is crucially important in the way that we either do something about this in a timely manner or fail to do so. So David Collings, I read the book a couple of years ago, well, a year ago or so, and I was just really interested, and that's how I started actually getting interested in doing a symposium on this particular issue. So I'm very curious to see what Dr. Collings has to say. David.
Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. I've been looking forward to this event for quite a while since I spoke with Reinmar and Rob. I've already had a lot of good conversations today. I look forward to more. So this talk is a little bit different. There's no PowerPoint. There are very few stories. There's very little data. I'm doing the oldest of old-fashioned things, just a heart-to-heart talk. So I hope you can handle it. Those of us concerned about climate change have for years pondered how best to share our concerns with the public, not only to explain the core scientific dimensions of the problem, but also to motivate concerted action to address it. Since it has been so far difficult to build public support for such action, we listen closely to what experts tell us about how best to shape a message, how to tailor our policy recommendations for those disinclined to accept them, and what narratives to use to inspire action. Attentiveness to these tactics is important for anyone who is realistic about the difficulty of making a strong case within a highly politicized public sphere. No one is under any illusions today that scientific findings about the biosphere speak for themselves. The forces of denial and indifference and of cultural and economic inertia are much too strong for that. Without a doubt, we must call on every resource we can muster. So far, we have relied especially on the science of climate change itself, clear descriptions of the best new practices in sustainable living, and smart ideas for new legislation to create economic incentives for all of us to make the necessary transition. All these efforts are indeed having an effect in the United States, but we still have work to do if we are to turn the tide and salvage a viable future for humanity in the forms of life that we know. Today, I'd like to explore ways in which the humanities might join this conversation and bring new strategies to bear in reaching out to the public. As a humanist who recently wrote a book on climate change for the general public, I'll draw on my own efforts in this regard, with apologies to those of you who are already familiar with the book. The strategies I'll share with you are only my own attempts to contribute to the general effort. They are by no means perfect. They come with no guarantee of success. Nevertheless, by sharing them with you today, I hope to inspire you to consider further ways to grapple with the core problems. Perhaps something I say today from the perspective of the humanities will be of use to you as you continue your work as scholars, teachers, citizens, and human beings. Let me begin by suggesting that one major challenge is to bring the broader temporality of climate change and environmental devastation more generally into contact with the temporality of human life. Typically, when participants in the public debate discuss the impact of climate change on humanity, they suggest that we must do something to protect a viable biosphere for our children and grandchildren. Such an appeal has a good basis, of course, for it does indeed capture a moral imperative to safeguard the environment for the generations to come. But to suggest that we are working primarily on behalf of others, some distance into the future, or some distance from us elsewhere on the planet, implies that the impact of climate change will not fall on us. It sets aside our awareness of what is already taking place for us. On one level, it's easy to emphasize the impact of climate change today if we just watch the news. The changes in the biosphere have already led to a host of major weather events, including extraordinarily intense typhoons and hurricanes, floods and storm surges, long droughts, as well as the onset of a mass extinction event and unprecedented changes in ecosystems and ways of life around the world. The impact on our generation is real and growing. There is no need to look to the future to make the case. A good first step, then, is to emphasize the impact of climate change here and now. While at first making this point might seem to appeal to people's selfishness, in the end, doing so may bring the core problems home to people more forcefully than ever, and thus motivate them to take action that will benefit themselves and others. Nevertheless, for many people, the prospect that the climate might do serious or lasting damage to them where they live doesn't seem to register. For us in the United States, the available resources seem to enable affected communities to recover soon enough for most of us to pretend that all is well, or at least going well enough. Natural disasters come and go, and life goes on. So it's crucial to move beyond the question of literal damage and begin to think about how climate change threatens to damage us all on a more personal, intimate, even emotional level. Since this is a central argument of my recent book, I'd like to explore it for a moment with you. As you no doubt know, time is running short if we wish to ward off irreversible, severe climate change. The recent international accord in Paris speaks of the goal of not raising the global average temperature more than 1.5 degrees centigrade over historical levels. While it is indeed wise for us to attempt to do so, unfortunately, as of 2012, we had already warmed the Earth 0.85 degrees, and the emissions currently in the atmosphere will cause the temperature to rise another 0.6 degrees due to the inertia of the planet's physical systems. In effect, then, we have already guaranteed that we'll nearly reach the 1.5 degree threshold through our past actions. If we add in the long work of persuading the world's nations to act more quickly to make the necessary changes, as well as the interval of time it will take to shift our energy infrastructure to a more sustainable basis, we must admit we'll easily reach a much higher threshold, and one much less friendly to the biosphere we know. Given our previous actions and the inertia of our culture, we're in danger of causing irreversible, severe climate change, and thus of endangering the future of the forms of life familiar to us. In that case, a key question addresses us. If our future is in danger of disappearing, what is the present for? How are we to live if that future is in doubt? As many resources in the humanities have taught us, and as our own life experiences confirm, we human beings are intentional creatures, conducting our lives according to stories whereby we describe to ourselves the purpose and aim of our activities as professionals, citizens, friends, lovers, and more. But to construct such narratives, we must rely on the sense that our human temporality is rooted in a viable temporality for all, in our belief that the biosphere itself will continue to provide an arena for our actions. Nearly everything we do in our ordinary lives is based on the assumption that we will have a future, that our houses will remain standing, the skills we have acquired will be useful, we will be able to participate in the cultural activities we care about, and we will have some chance to achieve our personal goals. Sustaining our relationships, cultivating our family ties and our friendships, raising children, providing health care to everyone, giving an education to the rising generation. All of these reveal how greatly we wish to sustain or improve the lives we already know, to hand them down to further generations, and to maintain at least something like our current level of abundance and happiness. Our orientation to the future, in short, provides the very pith and substance of our present. But what happens when, in reviewing the narratives of our lives, looking ahead to the future we hope to have, we realize that climate change will damage our world in ways that will directly and permanently affect us? What happens to our orientation to the future when its livability is cast into doubt and begins to dissolve? When we recognize that without concerted action, food and water shortages will become a perennial fact of life, economic growth a mirage, and the assumptions of our public discourse no longer apply? What if the place we choose for our home can no longer sustain us, the profession for which we have been trained is no longer needed, or the income we hoped would support us threatens to disappear? What if we realize that the life we wanted to lead is ecologically outrageous, that the children we've been raising have no chance to live as well as we have, and that the political causes we've long supported may never succeed? The answer, I think, is clear. All our present activities, our human relationships, our professions and goals are harmed in their very substance. The value of our ordinary activities begins to fray, and the entire framework of our lives becomes suspect. Climate change melts the Arctic ice cap, to be sure, but it also melts the narrative in which we still participate, the purpose of the present day. Climate change harms the future and the present alike. But that is not all. Most of us hope to transmit to new generations something of the values, achievements, and joys we have inherited from the past. When our future is cast into doubt, so also is the transmission of that past. We live in cultures that have long and storied histories, but without a future, that heritage, while still crucial and precious, becomes weightless, as if its very foundations have disappeared. Suddenly, this inheritance belongs to a planetary era that is passing away, for it was built on the security of an ecological framework that has collapsed. When the future is put into question, so are the present and the past. The entire framework of human time tilts, decays, and dissolves. What I'm describing here, then, amounts to an argument that climate change is more than a biophysical, political, and economic threat. It is an existential, emotional, and spiritual danger as well. If we take seriously the full range of its implications, it harms us simply as human beings, insofar as we wish to lead lives of significance and substance. Does it follow that we should give up, abandon our efforts, and live in despair? If a fairly dire version of climate change is likely to unfold, should we submit in total passivity? That would hardly be a solution. The prospect of a disappearing future does not erase the fact that we still have our ordinary lives to lead, that we still must satisfy our everyday needs, that we must earn a living and take care of those we love. However great our awareness of what may come, the necessities of life and our ethical obligations to each other demand that we carry on. Would it work to embrace our everyday lives with a vengeance, as if to escape our knowledge in doing so? Why not respond to our dilemma by saying, "I'll just keep working until the waters rise up and carry me away"? Something my former academic dean told me. But those who make this declaration would show that they value activity for its own sake, not for any purpose it might serve. They might hope to prove that they will not submit, that they can conquer any despair. While such a choice reveals a certain courage, it too is desperate. Pure stubbornness is no better a response than passive despair. The difficulty of our situation becomes clear, I think, only if we realize that the future is in doubt and that life goes on. As a result, even if we are aware of what is in store, we find ourselves having to endure as if nothing has changed. This contradiction is stark and irresolvable. Our orientation to the future inevitably remains, but it is directed towards what is no longer entirely there. We are caught between two imperatives. We must lead our lives, but we must also recognize that our life stories are no longer entirely credible. No plausible course of action is open to us. The dissolving future forces us to endure in a broken present. To consider our dilemma in these terms might seem to shift the focus from practical matters to less useful ones, directing attention to emotion when more serious business awaits. But if we become aware of the costs of inaction in this way, we might inspire far more passionate engagement in making a difference. If we can sense the validity of these reflections for ourselves, we might also be able to share them with others who similarly hope to have lives of significance. Perhaps then the opposite is true. By cutting through the tactics of distancing, whereby we think of the problem as applying to others later on, or of expertise, whereby we consign the problem to the researchers and technical experts who can fix it for us, or of scale, whereby we consider the problem to be too vast for us to comprehend or act upon, and recognizing instead how the crisis is taking place in our own lives, we may stumble upon a new way to share the urgency of the challenge, to speak more directly and humbly as mere human beings to a broad audience. But capturing the core personal dilemmas in this way may not be sufficient in itself to motivate ourselves or others to act. By addressing ourselves to others with this level of honesty about the fundamental impasses in which we live, we may inspire a similar honesty in return, and thus hear, to our surprise, honest explanations about the reluctance to act. Such responses would be a welcome development, for they would give us specific forms of stubbornness to work with, particular forms of indifference with which we can engage. It may be that the difficulty in reaching people comes not from articulating the case for action well, but from the difficulty of making a commitment and engaging with the problem in a focused, purposeful way. I would suggest then that it is urgent for us to find strong arguments to respond to such concerns, to override a certain reluctance to take on what can seem like extraordinary or heroic commitment. One objection is that we are caught within a nation and an international community that still refuses to alter its ways on a sufficient scale. If the nations of the earth are not doing what they must, why should I? Compared to such an immense problem, individual action is minuscule, almost vanishing into insignificance. Our first answer to such an objection is in some sense to agree. It's quite true that individual action can do very little in comparison to concerted national and international measures to address the key causes of climate change. But this is not an objection to a renewed ethics. It is rather a description of our first overriding and most pressing task, fighting hard for an ecological revolution. All other actions we might take pale in comparison. When our political institutions pose obstacles to the necessary transformation, we should become more creative, change tactics, and try new angles on the problem. If we fail again, we should persist with still further efforts. Nothing should ever intimidate us. But it does not follow that we need to do nothing to change our behavior in our own lives. If we are to take our share of responsibility for the global environmental crisis, we must commit ourselves to making a difference however we can. Doing so may be difficult if it's clear that we are still caught within a society that refuses to alter its ways. Yet we cannot use that fact as an excuse. Consider how we evaluate individuals caught in similar situations in the past. How merciful are we in our retrospective judgments of them? How tolerant are we, for example, toward a slaveholder who refused to liberate his, quotes, property, end quotes, on the excuse that his doing so would not by itself liberate all slaves? How well do we accept the plea of a woman living under the Nazis that she cooperated with the system of extermination because she did not have the power on her own to bring it to an end? The American refusal of the Nuremberg defense during the trials shortly after World War II says it all. Evil action, even when committed under orders, is not acceptable. If we are not likely to let such people off the hook, we must believe that people should do justice, whatever the odds, even in the face of impoverishment, punishment, or death. Since living in an environmentally responsible fashion would provoke no such threat against us today, we have even fewer excuses. Our criteria in those other cases should make our judgment about current behavior quite clear. But our fellow citizens may voice further objections to action. Many people may hesitate to take more eco-friendly actions in their lives because in their view, statistically speaking, personal action will have very little effect on the problem. I would submit that in response, one might argue that even if such action may be statistically insignificant, it is still necessary. Our ordinary moral compass tells us as much. If one of us kills someone we hate, statistically speaking, we would have reduced the human population by an almost infinitesimal amount. Similarly, if we break into someone's home to steal an object we coveted, we do virtually nothing to harm the gross national product. Yet we refuse to commit such actions for good reason. The same applies to environmental ethics. It's silly to imagine that driving a gas-guzzling vehicle is acceptable simply because that machine is only one of millions on the road. If we're destroying the biosphere, we're destroying it, and statistics is no excuse. A further, if not final objection, might be one of the toughest of all. Some fellow citizens may sense that the hour for action has mostly passed. They might suggest that in consequence, putting a major effort into warding off severe climate change is beside the point. It simply comes too late. Why worry about it if the die is cast and our future is already out of our hands? This turn from denial or indifference to despair may be more prevalent than we think and likely to increase greatly in the coming years. Once again, it is crucial for us to mount a serious response to it. On one level, we must insist that it is not yet entirely too late, that the actions we take today will indeed make a difference, for they may salvage some version of a livable planet for us all. But I would suggest that it is also necessary for us to contest the bitter, desperate assumption that if the hour is late, we should just give up and lead lives without ethical significance, openly becoming mere shells of human beings. Such a premise, which appears in discussions of climate change from people of every perspective, needs further consideration. I wish to suggest to you that if we are to inspire action from our fellow citizens, we need to dispute this premise boldly and without reserve. Here is what I suggest. If indeed we enter an era when it seems too late for action, when the distress of the planet is simply too great, we may have little choice but to shift our ground and discover a new basis for acting with justice. In that case, we would have to abandon all reference to the future, whether for ourselves, others, or the biosphere. Although a moment ago I suggested that nearly every action we take is grounded on our orientation to the future, under the pressure of severe planetary crisis, we would have to accept a point of view that has no such orientation, that takes its inspiration from a different resource. Adopting such an ethics, we would enact justice for another purpose entirely, one fulfilled in the act itself. We would do justice without calculating whether it would pay off in the long run, without measuring it according to the demands of a realistic common sense, accepting the possibility that it may have no results that would ever be visible to us or to others. In effect, we would aim for a good that is valuable in itself, a good visible perhaps only in our intention, in our sense of a justice without which the value of all action disappears. It might seem that anyone who could adopt such a practice would truly have exceeded the limits of self-interest and become something other than human. But acting in that manner, while unusual, is not outside ordinary human experience. Today, if someone we love contracts a terminal illness, we do not abandon that person. On the contrary, we care and love that person to the bitter end. Love's purpose is the person, not the future. However strange it may sound, those who practice an apparently impossible ethics enact a version of this love on another scale. The capacity to love and to act in this way, it is not far off. It is as intimate to us as our private relationships, as ordinary as our care for those we love. All we must do is expand on it and learn to care for a suffering biosphere as well. Such an argument, I would submit, gives us a permanent resource against resignation and despair. It provides for us a ground on which we can remain forever committed to doing justice, whether our societies make the necessary transition or not. Furthermore, with a reply of this kind to this objection, as well as others, we may be able to dismantle the range of excuses with which our fellow citizens dismiss the call for justice. Such, at least, is the prospect I would like to hold out for you today. There are many more questions on these themes that it would be fruitful to explore with you, though time does not permit me to do it right now. Perhaps we can do so in the panel discussion to follow. I will conclude simply with these thoughts. The range of questions we may ask of ourselves in our current dilemma is virtually limitless. For once we realize that the core assumptions about our life narratives are being undermined, nothing we once took for granted survives intact. The challenge to us as ordinary human beings is immense. As a result, it is crucial for us to integrate our sense of ordinary human life, of everyday emotion, into our thinking about climate change, and to invite humanistic reflection into the debate as a result. We should no longer delay the task, however difficult, of fostering a broader conversation among people of all disciplines, and of supporting each other and those with whom we share this planet with intelligence and compassion as we do so. Thank you.